A blizzard roars through the mountains when a lonely mountain man hears a knock at his cabin door. He opens it, and there she stands. An obese woman, half frozen, clutching a wooden cross. He mutters, "I haven't touched a woman in 10 years. She looks up and whispers, "Then maybe it's time you remembered how to be kind." Inside that storm-beaten cabin, two strangers share one fire, and a secret neither of them expects. She came seeking a new start, but the land she owns may destroy the only home he has left. As the snow deepens, so do the rumors, the danger, and a buried connection between her past and his dead wife's name. When greed and gossip close in, kindness becomes a weapon, and mercy might cost them everything. In a land ruled by silence and pride, what happens when love, long frozen, begins to thaw? Will a man who swore off touch risk everything for the woman who knocked on his door? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The blizzard's fury rattled the timber walls of Elijah Boone's mountain cabin like angry fists pounding to get in. Hunched over his workbench, he squinted in the weak lamplight at the steel trap between his calloused hands. His fingers, stiff from the cold, worked methodically at the rusty spring mechanism. The wind howled through gaps in the logs where the chinking had fallen away, making the lamp flame dance wildly across the cabin's Spartan interior. 10 years of solitude had taught him to ignore such sounds. 10 years since Sarah died. 10 years of speaking to no one but himself and God. And lately, not even to God. The cabin had slowly decayed around him, much like his spirit, but he barely noticed anymore. Half the roof had collapsed in the summer storms, forcing him to crowd his meager possessions into the remaining dry corner. He'd meant to fix it before winter. He meant to do a lot of things. The trap's spring suddenly snapped, nearly catching his thumb. Elijah muttered under his breath and reached for his oilcloth. The lamp guttered as another gust rattled the cabin's bones. Then he heard it, a sound different from the storm's rage. A pounding at his door, desperate and human. He froze, trap forgotten in his hands. Nobody came up this high in winter, especially not in a blizzard. The pounding came again, weaker this time. "Lord Almighty," he growled, setting down his work. The floorboards creaked beneath his heavy boots as he crossed to the door. The pounding had stopped. He hesitated, hand on the latch, heart thundering in his chest. 10 years since he'd welcomed anyone into this space. When he finally yanked the door open, the wind nearly tore it from his grip. Snow swirled into the cabin, and there on his porch, illuminated by the spilling lamplight, stood a woman. She was wrapped in a thin shawl crusted with ice, her round face blue with cold. Their eyes met for just a moment before her legs gave way and she collapsed forward. Elijah caught her automatically, surprised by her solid weight in his arms. She was a stout woman, middle-aged, her body shaking violently with cold. Around her neck hung a simple wooden cross. "Please," she whispered through chattering teeth. "My wagon broke down a mile back. I saw your light." She clutched at his shirt with trembling fingers. "I need warmth, just until morning." Elijah's throat went tight. He hadn't touched a woman since Sarah, hadn't wanted to. The feeling of this stranger's desperate grip on his shirt sent panic crawling up his spine. "I haven't touched a woman in 10 years, he muttered, more to himself than to her. His arms felt awkward and heavy where they supported her weight. The woman's eyes, though glazed with exhaustion and cold, fixed on his face. Despite her trembling, her voice carried a trace of steel when she spoke. "Then maybe it's time you remembered how to be kind." The word struck him like a physical blow. How long had it been since anyone had challenged him so directly? How long since he'd been anything but a ghost in these mountains? After another moment's hesitation, he lifted her fully into his arms. She was heavy, but years of working traps and hauling pelts had kept his strength. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the howling wind. The cabin's single room was barely warmer than outside. Elijah settled her in his only chair, the one by the dying fire. She immediately hunched toward the feeble warmth, shoulders shaking beneath her frozen shawl. "Name's Millie," she managed through chattering teeth. "Millie Dobbs." "Elijah Boone," he replied gruffly, already moving to add wood to the fire. The logs caught quickly, sending blessed heat into the room. "You said your wagon broke down?" Millie nodded, reaching her red hands toward the growing flames. "Wheel axle snapped. Everything I own, just sitting there in the snow." A tear rolled down her cheek, freezing before it reached her chin. "I was heading to Silverton. My Henry, my late husband, we always dreamed of having land out here." Elijah busied himself stoking the fire, uncomfortable with the emotion in her voice. The storm's fury increased outside, making the walls shudder. Snow drove through the gaps in the logs, forming small drifts on the floor. "You're lucky you found my light," he said finally. "Not many folks living this high up anymore." "The Lord guided my feet," Millie said softly, her hands clasped around her cross. "I prayed with every step, and he led me here." Elijah's jaw tightened at the mention of God. He hadn't prayed since Sarah died. Couldn't see the point anymore. But something in Millie's simple faith stirred a long-buried ache in his chest. He watched as she slowly began to thaw, color returning to her face. Her clothes were completely inadequate for mountain weather. A thin dress, worn boots, that threadbare shawl. City clothes. Kansas or Nebraska, by the look of them. She had no business being up here alone. "Storm's getting worse," he said, more harshly than he intended. "You'll have to stay till morning. Can't go back out in this." Millie's shoulders sagged with relief. "Much obliged, Mr. Boone. I know it's an imposition." "Ain't safe out there," he cut her off. "That's all." He turned away from her grateful look and began gathering what blankets he could find. They were rough things, some still carrying the musty smell of his last trapping expedition. But they were warm. He piled them beside her chair, then retreated to his workbench, determined to lose himself again in mending traps. But his hands wouldn't steady. The woman's presence filled the cabin like smoke, making it hard to breathe. He could hear her quiet movements, the rustle of blankets as she wrapped herself tighter, her occasional sniffling as she fought back tears. "You must think me a fool," she said suddenly, her voice stronger now that warmth had returned to her limbs. "A widow woman, trying to make it alone out here." Elijah's hands stilled on the trap. "Ain't my place to judge." "Henry and I saved for years to buy land out here. He died before we could make the journey." She gave a weak laugh. "Everyone back home said I was crazy to try it alone. Maybe they were right." "Why'd you come then?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. Millie was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Because sometimes you have to choose between dying safe at home or living dangerous in the wild." She touched her cross again. Henry understood that. He always said God doesn't give us dreams just to taunt us with them. Elijah's chest tightened. He remembered similar conversations with Sarah before the fever took her. Dreams of children, of a proper farm, of a life bigger than just surviving. He'd buried those dreams with her, retreating to this half-ruined cabin where at least the loneliness was honest. The wind shrieked louder, and suddenly snow began pouring through the collapsed section of roof. Millie gasped as the bitter cold rushed in. Without thinking, Elijah crossed to her chair and helped her up, guiding her to the drier corner where his bed lay. "It ain't much," he muttered, "but it's out of the weather." Their hands touched as he steadied her, and he nearly jerked away at the shock of it. Her fingers were warm now, soft despite their obvious strength. A baker's hands, he realized, noticing the old burn marks and the way she unconsciously kneaded her palms together. "Thank you," she whispered, and there were tears in her eyes again. But these weren't tears of fear or cold. They were tears of gratitude, of human kindness recognized and received. Elijah retreated quickly to his workbench, but he couldn't focus on the traps anymore. The storm raged outside, sealing them together in this moment, in this space. He listened to Millie's breathing slowly steady as she warmed, listened to her quiet prayers of thanksgiving. Each whispered word seemed to chip away at the ice he'd built around his heart these past 10 years. Hours passed. The lamp burned low. Elijah added more wood to the fire, watching the shadows dance across Millie's sleeping face. She looked peaceful now, wrapped in his rough blankets, her cross still clutched in one hand. The other hand lay open, as if reaching out even in sleep. He remembered Sarah's hands, how they'd reached for his in those final fever-racked days. He'd held on until the end, but afterward, he couldn't bear to touch another living soul. Easier to be alone, safer to let the cold take everything but the basic will to survive. But now, watching this stranger who'd trusted him with her life, who'd challenged him to remember kindness, Elijah felt something shift deep inside. Like spring ice breaking up on the river, dangerous and beautiful all at once. The blizzard showed no signs of weakening. Snow continued to drift through the gaps in his walls, but the fire kept its fury at bay. In the corner, Millie slept on, her presence slowly transforming his hermit's cell into something that almost felt like home again. Elijah settled back on his stool, trap forgotten in his hands, and allowed himself to remember what it was like to not be alone. The night grew deeper, and the storm raged on, but inside the cabin something frozen had begun to thaw. Gray light crept through the frost-covered windows as dawn struggled to break through the relentless storm. The blizzard had not weakened. If anything, the wind howled with renewed fury, driving sheets of snow against the cabin's weathered walls. Inside, Elijah moved quietly, trying not to wake his unexpected guest as he stirred the banked coals in the pot-belly stove. Millie stirred beneath the pile of blankets, roused by the metallic scraping sound. She blinked, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar surroundings, then offered a tentative smile. "Good morning, Mr. Boone." Elijah grunted in response, reaching for his dented coffee pot. His movements were stiff from sleeping upright on his workbench stool, but he'd managed a few hours of rest between feeding the fire. He measured out the precious grounds with careful fingers, watching from the corner of his eye as Millie sat up slowly, wincing. "I reckon everything hurts this morning," she said, rubbing her lower back. Despite her obvious discomfort, her voice carried a note of cheer that seemed out of place in his gloomy cabin. "But I'm grateful to be hurting in here instead of out there." The coffee began to bubble, filling the cabin with its bitter aroma. Elijah pulled 2 tin cups from a shelf, hesitating before setting both down. It had been so long since he'd shared coffee with anyone, the simple gesture felt foreign. "Much obliged," Millie said as he handed her a steaming cup. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them around the warm metal. "I lost my horse yesterday," she added quietly. "Poor thing. Slipped on the ice about 3 miles back." Broke its leg. I had to. Her voice caught. Well, the mule's still tied up out there, if he's survived the night. All my worldly possessions are still in that broken wagon, too. Elijah's jaw tightened. A mule left out in this weather might already be dead, and even if it wasn't, the animal would be suffering. He set his coffee down with a sharp click. We'd best check on him. We? Millie's eyebrows rose in surprise. Can't let you go out alone in this. He was already pulling on his heavy coat and wrapping a wool scarf around his neck. You'd get lost 10 feet from the door. To his surprise, Millie laughed. You're probably right. I don't have much experience with mountain weather. She struggled to her feet, swaying slightly. Though I reckon I've got more weight than any mule can handle. The self-deprecating joke caught Elijah off guard. Most folks he'd known would have gotten defensive about their size, but Millie seemed to wear hers with a kind of matter-of-fact acceptance. He found himself almost smiling as he handed her his spare coat. It'll be big on you, he said, but it's better than that shawl. Together they pushed out into the storm. The wind nearly knocked Millie off her feet, but Elijah's steady hand on her elbow kept her upright. Snow had drifted higher than his waist in places, and they had to break trail step by careful step. Millie's breathing grew labored, but she didn't complain, even when they had to stop several times to rest. They found the mule exactly where she'd left it, huddled against a stand of pine trees. The animal was covered in snow but still standing, ears perking up at their approach. Elijah checked it over with practiced hands, while Millie crooned softly to it, scratching under its frozen chin. He's sound, Elijah announced, surprised and impressed. Tough old fellow. Like someone else I know, Millie said with a gentle smile that made Elijah look away quickly. It took them over an hour to reach her wagon. The broken axle had pitched it at an awkward angle, but most of her belongings were still secured under the canvas cover. Together they salvaged what they could carry. 2 trunks of clothing and household goods, a box of cooking implements, and most precious to Millie, her father's family Bible, and a small wooden box containing her baking supplies. Yeast and sourdough starter, she explained, as Elijah secured the box carefully to the mule's pack. Can't very well open a bakery without them. The trek back to the cabin was slow and exhausting. Elijah found himself watching Millie with growing respect as she pushed through the deep snow, never complaining even when she stumbled. Her determination reminded him of Sarah, who had faced every hardship with the same quiet strength. By the time they reached the cabin, they were both covered in snow and breathing hard. Millie's face was red from exertion and cold, but her eyes sparkled with triumph as they carried her belongings inside. Now then, she said, already unwrapping her precious box of baking supplies. Let me thank you properly for all this help. When was the last time you had fresh biscuits? Elijah started to protest, but Millie was already rolling up her sleeves. I won't take no for an answer, Mr. Boone. It's the least I can do, and besides, she patted her ample middle with a wink, I didn't get this way by turning down chances to bake. Before he could object further, she had taken over his small cooking area. Her movements were sure and practiced as she measured flour into a bowl, adding a pinch of this and a dash of that with the confidence of someone who had done it thousands of times before. Soon the cabin filled with the mouth-watering smell of baking bread. Elijah tried to focus on mending his traps, but his eyes kept straying to Millie as she worked. There was something almost magical about the way she transformed his sparse provisions into something that made his cabin smell like a proper home. These won't be my best, she apologized as she pulled golden brown biscuits from the oven. The altitude affects the rising something fierce, but they'll fill an empty stomach and that's what matters. Elijah took a bite and had to close his eyes. The biscuit was light and fluffy, unlike anything he'd eaten in years. His own cooking ran to basic fare: beans, salt pork, the occasional piece of game. This was a taste of civilization, of comfort he'd forgotten existed. "I'm planning to open a bakery in Silverton," Millie said as they ate, breaking the comfortable silence. "Found a little store for rent right on Blair Street. Folks back home laughed when I told them. Said a widow woman had no business striking out alone, especially one my size." She brushed crumbs from her fingers, her expression determined. "But I figured it was better to try and fail than wonder what if for the rest of my life." Elijah studied her across the table, seeing beyond her plain features to the strength beneath. "Silverton's a rough town," he said finally. "Mining camp manners, not much call for fancy baking." "Every town needs bread," Millie replied simply, "and every soul needs a taste of sweetness now and then, even ones that think they don't deserve it anymore." Her words hit too close to home. Elijah pushed back from the table, suddenly unable to meet her knowing gaze. He busied himself adding wood to the stove, aware of how little kindness he'd shown anyone in recent years. Even this simple hospitality had felt like a massive effort at first, though now. The storm continued to rage outside as evening approached, painting the windows with frost flowers. Millie had spent the afternoon organizing her belongings while Elijah worked on his traps, but the silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. The cabin felt different with her presence, warmer somehow, and not just from the heat of the stove. As darkness fell, Elijah added more wood to the fire. He stood for a long moment, watching the flames dance, before turning to face Millie. "You can stay till the storm quits," he mumbled, the words coming out gruff despite his best intentions. "Ain't safe to travel anyway." Millie's smile lit up her entire face. "Thank you, Mr. Boone, though I hope you won't regret offering when you see how much I can eat." Her self-deprecating humor startled another almost smile from him. "Reckon anyone who can bake like that has earned their keep." Outside, the wind howled its lonely song, but inside the cabin something had changed. The walls that had witnessed 10 years of Elijah's solitude now held the warm smell of fresh bread, the soft sound of Millie's humming as she worked, and the first tentative sparks of companionship neither of them had expected to find in the heart of a mountain storm. Dawn crept over the San Juan Mountains, painting the snow-laden peaks in shades of rose and gold. The storm had blown itself out during the night, leaving behind a crystalline silence and temperatures that made the wooden walls of Elijah's cabin creak and groan. Elijah stood at his frost-covered window, watching his breath cloud the glass. The morning sun revealed a transformed landscape, familiar paths and markers buried under feet of pristine snow. He'd need snowshoes to check his trap lines today. Behind him, he could hear Millie stoking the stove's embers back to life, her movements already familiar in his small space. "Looks like the Lord blessed us with clear skies," Millie said cheerfully, measuring coffee grounds into his battered pot. "Though I reckon he forgot to turn up the heat a mite." Elijah grunted in response, pulling on his heavy wool coat. "Got to check my lines. Might be gone most of the day." He paused, uncomfortable with the need to explain himself. 10 years of solitude hadn't prepared him for considering another person's feelings. "There's dried meat in that sack by the door, if you get hungry." Millie waved away his concern with a flour-dusted hand. "Don't you worry about me, Mr. Boone. I've got plenty to keep me busy right here." She was already examining his cabin with the appraising eye of a woman used to making do. "This place could use a woman's touch, if you don't mind my saying so." Something in Elijah's chest tightened at her words. The last woman's touch this cabin had known was Sarah's, and he'd let everything fall to ruin after she'd gone. He strapped on his snowshoes without responding, checking his rifle and sliding extra ammunition into his pocket. As he reached for the door, Millie's voice filled the cabin again, but this time in song. The hymn stopped him cold, his hand frozen on the latch. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The familiar melody wrapped around him like a physical thing, squeezing the breath from his lungs. It had been Sarah's favorite. She'd sung it while kneading bread, while hanging wash, while rocking their dead baby. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Sarah's voice growing weaker as the fever took her, still trying to hum that damned hymn until the end. "Something wrong, Mr. Boone?" Millie's voice cut through the memory, concern evident in her tone. Elijah realized he was still standing with his hand on the door, knuckles white against the wood. "No," he said roughly. "Just pick a different song." He didn't wait for her response, pushing out into the bitter morning air. The cold slapped at his face, a welcome distraction from the echoes of the past that Millie's innocent singing had awakened. The snow was deep but powdery, his snowshoes leaving clean tracks as he set off toward his first trap line. The work was harder than usual, each trap requiring careful digging through feet of fresh snow. But Elijah welcomed the physical effort, the simple focus of checking each site and resetting the mechanisms. It was easier than thinking about the woman who had invaded his solitude, bringing with her memories he'd tried so hard to bury. The sun was well past its peak when he finally turned back towards the cabin, his game bag holding 2 rabbits and a fox. The temperature had dropped even further, and the wind had picked up, driving needle-sharp crystals of snow into any exposed skin. As he approached his home, he noticed something different. Smoke rose straight and strong from the chimney, not the weak trickle he usually managed. And was that the smell of bread? Inside, the transformation stopped him in his tracks. His cabin, which had been little more than a shelter for years, had somehow become homey. The floor had been swept, the windows cleaned of grime. His few dishes were arranged neatly on their shelf, and something bubbled promisingly in his old iron pot over the fire. The air was rich with the smell of baking bread and some kind of stew. But what caught his eye was his spare coat, the one he'd thought beyond repair after snagging it on barbed wire last month. It hung by the fire, the tear mended so neatly he could hardly see where it had been. "Hope you don't mind," Millie said from where she stood kneading bread dough. "I found needle and thread in my trunk, and that coat looked like it needed some attention." "You didn't have to do all this," Elijah said, his voice harsher than he'd intended. "I didn't ask you to take over my home?" Millie's hands stilled in the dough, but her voice remained calm. "No, you didn't ask. You did something far more important. You saved my life." She looked up at him then, her plain face serious. "I'd have frozen to death out there if you hadn't opened your door. Fixing a coat and making some bread seems a poor return for that kind of mercy, but it's what I have to give." Elijah looked away from her steady gaze, ashamed of his outburst. He busied himself with hanging up his game bag and removing his snow-covered outer clothes. "What's in the pot?" he asked finally, an awkward peace offering. "Bean stew with the last of my salt. Pork," Millie answered, returning to her kneading. "Should be ready by sundown, if you're hungry." The rest of the afternoon passed in relative quiet. Elijah cleaned his kills while Millie shaped her bread into loaves and set them to rise near the stove. The domestic sounds of her work, the soft pat of dough, the clatter of the pot lid as she checked the stew, the whisper of her skirts as she moved about the cabin, created a strange ache in his chest. He'd forgotten how it felt to share space with another person, to exist in the comfortable rhythm of everyday tasks done together. As darkness gathered outside, Millie set 2 bowls of steaming stew on his rough-hewn table. The smell made his mouth water. It had been years since he'd eaten food prepared by someone else's hands. But before he could pick up his spoon, Millie bowed her head. "Heavenly Father," she began, her voice soft but clear, "we thank you for this borrowed roof and the man who shared it. Thank you for safe harbor in the storm, for daily bread, and for reminding us that no soul is meant to weather this life alone. Amen." Elijah sat with his head awkwardly lowered, unsure what to do with his hands or his thoughts. Prayer had been Sarah's domain, like so many other gentle things he'd let slip away after her death. The silence that followed Millie's words felt heavy with things unsaid, with grief unvoiced, and faith long abandoned. The moment was broken by an unexpected sound, the muffled thud of hoofbeats approaching through the snow. Elijah's head snapped up, his hand automatically reaching for his rifle. In 10 years, no one had ever found his cabin by accident, especially not in weather like this. The hoofbeats grew louder, clear now in the brittle cold of the winter night. Millie looked at him questioningly, but Elijah was already moving toward the door, his expression grim. The peace of their shared meal evaporated like morning frost, replaced by the wariness of a man unused to visitors and the weight of approaching change. The hoofbeats drew closer, crunching through the packed snow. Elijah's hand tightened on his rifle as he moved toward the door. Few knew the location of his cabin, and fewer still would brave these trails after a blizzard. Through the frosted window, a figure emerged from the gathering darkness, the horse's breath steaming in the cold air. "Deputy Crane," Elijah muttered, recognizing the rider's familiar silhouette. He relaxed his grip on the rifle but didn't set it aside. Will Crane was a fair man, as lawmen went, but his presence this far up the mountain meant trouble. Millie stood uncertainly by the table, her hands twisting in her apron. "Should I?" "Stay put," Elijah said, opening the door to the bitter night air. The deputy's horse stamped in the snow, its sides heaving from the climb. Will Crane sat tall in his saddle, frost coating his thick mustache and the brim of his hat. His badge caught the lamplight streaming from the cabin. "Evening. Boone," Crane called out, his voice carrying in the still air. "Mind if I warm up a spell?" Elijah stepped aside, wordless. The deputy dismounted stiffly, leading his horse to the lean-to where Millie's mule stood. When he entered the cabin, he removed his hat, revealing surprise in his weathered features at the sight of Millie. "Ma'am," he said, nodding politely. "Didn't expect to find company up here with Boone." "Millie Dobbs," she replied, already reaching for another cup. "The storm caught me on the trail. Mr. Boone was kind enough to offer shelter." Crane's eyebrows rose slightly at the word kind, but he kept his peace. He stomped the snow from his boots and moved closer to the stove, holding his hands out to the warmth. The cabin fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the crack of burning wood and the whistle of wind outside. Millie poured coffee for all three of them, the rich aroma filling the small space. Crane accepted his cup with a grateful nod, taking a long drink before speaking. "Good coffee, ma'am. Been a long ride up here." "What brings you, deputy?" Elijah asked, his voice rough with disuse. He remained standing, watching Crane with careful eyes. The deputy set his cup down, his expression growing serious. "Land matter, actually. New survey came in from Denver last week. They've been remapping the whole territory." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. There's a problem with some boundaries up here." Millie settled into a chair, her face showing concern. "What kind of problem?" Crane spread the survey map on the table, weighted down by cups. His finger traced a line along the river. "According to this, there's about 40 acres of overlap between two claims. One's an old trap line," he glanced at Elijah, "and the other's a newer homestead grant." Elijah's shoulders tensed. My trapline's been registered for 12 years. Yes, but... Crane hesitated, looking at Millie. Ma'am, you said your name was Dobbs? Would you be the one who filed claim papers last month, inheriting from a Harriet Boone? The color drained from Millie's face. Yes, that's right. She was my friend in Kansas. She left me the land when she passed, said it would give me a fresh start out here. She looked between the two men. Is there something wrong with the claim? Elijah's coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth. For a moment, he seemed carved from stone, only his eyes moving as they fixed on Millie. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Harriet Boone was my wife's cousin. The silence that followed was as heavy as the snow outside. Millie's hands trembled as she set her cup down. Your wife's cousin? But she never mentioned. She wouldn't have, Elijah cut in, his tone sharp. There was bad blood after Sarah died. Harriet blamed me for not getting the doctor in time. He turned away, facing the darkness beyond the window. Didn't know she still held claim to any land up here. Deputy Crane cleared his throat uncomfortably. Well, according to the papers, she maintained a partial claim on the riverbank property. Never developed it, but kept up the taxes. When she died, she left it to Mrs. Dobbs here. He tapped the map. Problem is, it overlaps Boone's established trapline, including the best access to the river. Millie's voice was small but steady. What happens now? Come spring thaw, one of these claims will have to be invalidated, Crane said. Can't have two people claiming the same 40 acres, especially not with water rights involved. He folded the map carefully. You'll both need to file your papers in Silverton before the ice breaks. Judge Wilson can sort it out then. Elijah's back remained turned, his silence speaking volumes. Millie stared at her hands, folded tightly in her lap. The wind moaned around the cabin corners, a lonely sound that seemed to echo the tension within. Crane finished his coffee and stood, reaching for his hat. I'd best get back before it gets any later. Storm's passed, but it's still treacherous after dark. He nodded to Millie. Ma'am. To Elijah's back. Boone. Neither moved as the deputy let himself out. The sound of hoofbeats faded slowly into the night, leaving behind a silence that seemed to fill every corner of the cabin. Finally, Elijah yanked open the door and strode out into the darkness, not bothering with his coat. Millie watched through the window as his figure moved through the snow toward the ridge, barely visible in the starlight. His shoulders were hunched against more than just the cold. She turned back to the stove, adding another log to the dying fire. The flames caught and crackled, throwing warm light across the walls. God never meant kindness to be easy, she murmured to herself, her voice barely audible above the fire's snap. The words hung in the air like frost, a prayer and a recognition of the complicated paths that led broken people to each other's doors. The cabin felt colder now, despite the renewed fire. Millie stood in the warmth of the stove, watching the door and waiting for Elijah's return, knowing that the simple shelter they'd found in each other's company had just become far more complex. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the human dramas playing out beneath them, while the wind continued its lonely song through the San Juan peaks. Dawn crept over the mountains like a timid creature, casting long shadows across the fresh snow. The morning light filtered through the cabin's frosted windows, but neither of its occupants seemed eager to acknowledge the new day, or each other. Millie moved quietly around the small space, her usual cheerful humming notably absent. She gathered dishes from the previous night's meal, stealing glances at Elijah's broad back as he stood at the window, staring out at nothing. The revelation about Harriet Boone hung between them like smoke, thick and suffocating. Elijah grabbed his axe without a word, letting the door bang shut behind him. The rhythmic thunk of wood being split soon filled the crisp morning air. Millie tried to focus on her tasks, sweeping the floor, feeding the cook stove, checking their dwindling supplies. But her mind kept circling back to the deputy's news. How strange that fate had led her to this very cabin, to this very man connected to Harriet through tragedy. Through the window she watched Elijah work. His movements were mechanical, almost angry, as he swung the axe. Each blow seemed to carry the weight of old guilt. Sweat froze on his beard despite the bitter cold, and his breath came out in great white clouds. The morning stretched on, marked only by the steady crack of splitting wood and the soft shuffle of Millie's indoor chores. When she needed water, she grabbed the bucket and stepped carefully onto the packed snow. The path to the well was treacherous after yesterday's storm, glazed with a sheet of ice beneath the fresh powder. She had almost reached the well when her foot hit a slick spot. The bucket flew from her hands as she windmilled her arms, trying to catch her balance. A sharp gasp escaped her lips as she felt herself falling. Elijah's head snapped up at the sound. Without hesitation, he dropped the axe and rushed toward her, covering the distance in long strides. His hand shot out to catch her, then froze mid-reach, hovering in the space between them. For a heartbeat, they stood frozen in tableau. Millie teetering on the ice, Elijah's face twisted with indecision, his outstretched fingers trembling with more than just cold. Millie caught herself against the well's rough stones, steadying her own footing. "I'm all right," she said softly, understanding more than just his aborted attempt to help. The pain in his eyes spoke of deeper fears than letting someone fall. Elijah withdrew his hand as if burned, turning back toward his woodpile. But his shoulders remained tense, his movements less certain than before. Millie retrieved her bucket in silence, filled it carefully, and made her way back inside with small, cautious steps. The day passed in this careful dance of avoidance, each of them hyper-aware of the other's presence while trying to maintain their distance. But as evening approached and the temperature dropped further, they could no longer ignore the necessity of conversation. They needed to discuss their shared predicament. Millie was stirring a pot of bean soup when Elijah finally came inside, bringing an armload of wood with him. He stacked it carefully by the stove, his movements deliberate, as if gathering courage. "About the claim," he said at last, his voice rough from disuse. Millie kept stirring, giving him time to find his words. Steam rose from the pot, carrying the scent of herbs and salt pork through the cabin. "I can forfeit my portion," she offered quietly. "Find another piece of land to—" "No." The word came out sharper than he intended, making them both flinch. Elijah softened his tone. "No charity. You've got as much right to it as anyone. More, maybe, being Harriet's heir." "Then what do you suggest?" Millie turned from the stove, meeting his eyes directly for the first time that day. "Deputy Crane said we need to sort it before spring thaw." Elijah ran a hand through his graying beard, considering. "Spring's months away yet. Snow won't break till April, maybe May up here." He glanced around the cabin, then back at her. "Reckon we could share the space till then? Figure out what's fair?" Millie's eyes widened slightly at the suggestion. "Share it? You mean—" "Cabin's small, but it's shelter. River's got enough fish for two. Might even be able to repair that old root cellar come warmer weather." He spoke quickly, as if afraid to lose his nerve. "Unless you'd rather head down to Silverton now." "No," Millie said, surprising them both with her certainty. "No, I think sharing might be wise, at least until spring gives us more options." Relief flickered across Elijah's features, gone almost before it appeared. He nodded once, then moved to fetch bowls for their supper. The tension in the cabin eased slightly, replaced by a tentative sense of purpose. They ate in companionable silence, the fire crackling in the stove. Outside, the last light faded from the sky, leaving the snow glowing with an ethereal blue cast in the gathering dusk. Millie's spoon scraped the bottom of her bowl, the sound loud in the quiet cabin. "Tell me about him," Elijah said suddenly, his voice so low she almost missed it. "About who?" "Your husband." He kept his eyes on his bowl. "If you've a mind to share." Millie set down her spoon, her hands falling still in her lap. The firelight threw dancing shadows across her face as she gathered her thoughts. "Thomas was a dreamer," she began softly, "always chasing the next big thing. We had a good life in Kansas, a little shop where I baked, a house that was nearly paid for. But when news of the gold strikes out here reached us..." She shook her head, a sad smile touching her lips. "He sold everything, said we'd be rich within a year." Elijah listened intently, his own meal forgotten. The wind whispered around the cabin corners, a lonely counterpoint to her words. "The mine was up near Central City. Thomas worked 16 hours a day, convinced the next swing of his pick would hit the mother lode." Millie's voice grew distant, lost in memory. "I took in washing, did what I could to keep us fed. Then one day there was a collapse." She fell silent, staring into the fire. Elijah didn't press, just waited patiently until she was ready to continue. After he was gone, I didn't know what to do. Couldn't go back to Kansas. Nothing left there. Couldn't seem to move forward either. But then I remembered my little shop. How good it felt to have flour on my hands, to smell bread baking. Her voice strengthened. I learned to bake again because it kept me from breaking. Each loaf was a reason to get up, to keep trying. "And that's why you want the land?" Elijah asked quietly. "To build your bakery?" Millie nodded. "Silverton's growing. Folks there need more than just beans and salt pork. They need the smell of fresh bread, the taste of something sweet now and then. Sounds foolish, maybe." "No," Elijah cut in, his voice gruff with emotion. "No, it ain't foolish at all." Their eyes met across the table, understanding passing between them. They were both broken in their own ways, both seeking something more than mere survival in these mountains. The firelight flickered between them, casting warm shadows that seemed to soften the hard edges of their pain. Outside, the snow-covered peaks glowed with that strange blue light that comes only on the coldest nights, when the stars shine like diamonds and the world holds its breath. Inside the cabin, two lonely souls found themselves a little less alone, bound together by circumstance and shared grief, but also by the first fragile threads of trust. Millie rose to clear the dishes, her movements less hesitant than before. Elijah added wood to the stove, the familiar task somehow different now that it served them both. Neither spoke again, but the silence had changed. It was no longer a wall between them, but a shared space where understanding could grow. The evening settled around them like a gentle blanket, full of possibilities neither dared name. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they had found a way forward together, even if only until the spring thaw came to change everything again. The days settled into a gentle rhythm, like the steady kneading of bread dough. Each morning Millie would rise before dawn, stoking the stove's embers back to life. The metallic clang of the door and scrape of wood being added hardly stirred Elijah anymore. He'd grown used to the sounds of another person sharing his space. By the time he finished his morning chores, the cabin would be filled with the yeasty warmth of rising bread. Some days it was simple loaves, crusty and brown. Other times she'd add dried berries or nuts, transforming plain flour into something special. The scents wrapped around him like invisible hands, tugging at memories he'd thought long buried. Elijah found himself lingering over repairs that needed doing inside rather than out. He'd sharpen his knives at the table, work leather into new straps, or mend torn clothing, all while stealing glances at Millie's sure movements around the stove. Her hands were confident, knowing exactly how much flour to add without measuring, just the right pressure to apply to the dough. She hummed while she worked, old hymns mostly, their familiar tunes drifting through the cabin like smoke. A week of this domestic peace passed before reality intruded. Their supplies were running low, flour especially, with all the baking, and several tools needed replacing. They couldn't put off a trip to town any longer. "We'll hitch up early tomorrow," Elijah announced over supper one evening. "Beat the worst of the day's cold." Millie nodded, though her fingers worried at her shawl. "I've made a list of what we need. Flour, of course, and salt. That old pot's got a crack that needs replacing, too." "Mule should manage it all right," he said, watching her face. "Road's packed down good now." Morning came sharp and clear, the kind of cold that made breathing feel like swallowing needles. They hitched Millie's mule to Elijah's small wagon, padding the animal's hooves with burlap against the snow. Millie wrapped herself in every layer she owned, looking like a colorful, overstuffed chair. The sight almost brought a smile to Elijah's weathered face. The journey to Silverton took most of the morning. The mule picked its way carefully down the mountain trail, steam puffing from its nostrils. Millie kept up a gentle stream of conversation, pointing out interesting rock formations or telling stories about her baking mishaps. Elijah mostly listened, offering occasional grunts of acknowledgement, but the silence between her words felt comfortable now, not strained. The first whispers started as soon as they entered town. Elijah heard them clearly. Cruel comments about Millie's size, speculation about what a respectable woman was doing living with the mountain hermit, sneering predictions about her bakery plans failing. His jaw tightened with each muttered word. At the general store, a group of men lounged against the porch railing, making no effort to hide their mocking stares as Millie climbed down from the wagon. One of them nudged another, whispering something that made them all snicker. Elijah's hand tightened on the wagon seat until his knuckles went white. He turned slowly, fixing them with the kind of stare he usually reserved for wolves near his trap lines. The laughter died in their throats. One by one, they found urgent business elsewhere, leaving the porch empty. Inside the store, Millie moved efficiently through their list, seemingly unbothered by the sideways glances and whispered comments. She haggled firmly but fairly with the shopkeeper over flour prices, arranged for the delivery of some larger items to be sent up when the weather allowed, and even managed to charm the man's wife into sharing a recipe for sourdough starter. It wasn't until they were loading the wagon that she spoke about it. "Thank you," she said quietly, adjusting a sack of flour. "For what you did back there. Though I've heard worse, truth be told." Elijah secured a crate of supplies before answering. "Ain't right, how they treat you." "No," she agreed, "but their opinions matter less than they think. I learned long ago that other people's cruelty says more about them than me." She patted the mule's flank. "Besides, I've got flour for baking now, and that's what matters." The return journey started peacefully enough. The mule seemed pleased with its lighter load heading, uphill, and the afternoon sun had taken some bite from the air. They were about halfway home when they passed the frozen creek, its surface glittering like broken glass in the winter light. Elijah fell silent, his eyes fixed on the ridge above it. Millie waited, sensing the weight of memory settling over him like fresh snow. "Used to fish here?" he finally said, his voice rough. Sarah loved watching the water, said it reminded her of music. Millie's hand stilled in her lap. This was the first time he'd spoken his wife's name aloud. We'd spend whole afternoons here in summer, he continued, as if the words were being pulled from him. She'd read while I fished, sometimes sing, voice like an angel she had. He swallowed hard. Caught fever that winter. Nothing I could do but watch her fade. Buried her up there, on that ridge where she loved to sit. Haven't gone near another woman since. Couldn't bear it. The mule plodded on, its hooves making soft, crunching sounds in the snow. Millie waited until the rigid set of Elijah's shoulders eased slightly before speaking. Then maybe God waited till now to bring you back to the living, she said softly. Elijah's hands tightened on the reins, but he didn't speak. The frozen creek fell behind them as they continued up the mountain, but something in the air between them had shifted, like ice beginning to thaw. They reached the cabin as evening was settling in, the sky turning that peculiar shade of purple that only comes with winter twilight. Together they unloaded the wagon, storing supplies and settling the mule for the night. Their movements around each other had grown smoother over the past week, each anticipating the other's needs without having to ask. Inside, Millie immediately set about starting a fresh batch of bread dough. To keep the warmth in the cabin, she said, though they both knew it was more than that. The familiar motions of measuring and mixing seemed to settle her, and gradually the tension from town eased from her shoulders. Elijah built up the fire, stealing glances at her work. The soft sounds of dough being kneaded, the dusting of flour catching the firelight, the quiet humming that had become as much a part of his cabin as the creak of floorboards. All of it struck him suddenly as precious, like finding a gold nugget in his pan when he'd only been looking for drinking water. The admission about Sarah had loosened something in his chest, a knot of grief he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it wasn't part of his natural shape. Watching Millie work, her movements sure and peaceful despite the day's difficulties, he felt the first real stirring of hope he'd known in years. Night settled fully around the cabin, bringing with it the deep cold that made the walls pop and groan. But inside, the bread rose in its bowl, filling the air with promise. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they had warmth and work and a companionship neither had expected to find in these snow-covered mountains. The evening passed quietly, each lost in their own thoughts, but comfortable in the shared silence. When Millie finally laid the finished loaves out to cool, their fresh-baked scent seemed to fill every corner of the cabin, chasing away the last lingering shadows of loneliness. The general store's bell jangled as Millie and Elijah stepped inside, shaking snow from their coats. They had returned to Silverton to file her land claim, hoping to settle matters before spring brought more complications. The warmth inside fogged Elijah's spectacles, but he could still make out the way people turned to stare. Thomas Hartle stood by the counter, his fine wool coat and polished boots marking him as different from the miners and traders who frequented the store. The mine owner's lips curled into a smirk as he watched Millie make her way between the narrow aisles. "Well, well," Hartle drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "If it isn't our mountain hermit. Found yourself a plump housekeeper, have you, Boone? Quite generous of you to take in strays." The store fell silent. Elijah's hands clenched into fists, his jaw tightening until it ached. But before he could move, Millie's gentle touch landed on his arm. "Mr. Hartle," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I reckon a man of your standing has better things to do than concern himself with other folks' business." Hartle's eyes narrowed. "Just looking out for local interests, ma'am. We wouldn't want anyone taking advantage of our simpler citizens." "The only simple thing I see," Millie replied, "is how quick some folks are to judge what they don't understand." Several of the customers tried to hide their smiles. Hartle's face darkened, but he maintained his artificial politeness. "I understand you're here to file a land claim, rather ambitious for someone of your circumstances." Elijah took a step forward, but Millie's grip tightened on his arm. Her touch was like a rope holding back a bull, and he forced himself to stay still. "My circumstances," Millie said calmly, "include a legal inheritance and honest intentions. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have business at the land office." They left Hartle fuming by the counter and made their way to the small building that housed the land registry. Inside, the clerk's expression shifted from boredom to poorly concealed amusement as Millie presented her papers. "A bakery, you say?" The clerk snickered, sharing a look with his assistant. "And you plan to run this yourself?" "That's right," Millie answered, her chin held high despite the flush creeping up her neck. "Well, isn't that sweet?" More suppressed laughter. "Though I must say, the location seems rather peculiar. Quite a distance from town, and overlapping with existing claims." Elijah stepped forward, his shadow falling across the desk. "The lady asked you to process her claim. That's your job, ain't it?" The clerk's smile faltered under Elijah's hard stare. "Yes, well, there are procedures, you understand. Reviews required. We'll need time to verify everything." They left the office with nothing but vague promises and poorly hidden mockery ringing in their ears. Elijah's anger simmered like a pot about to boil over. The urge to return and teach those men some manners burned in his chest. "We need to see Pastor Grady," Millie said quietly, leading them toward the small church at the edge of town. The church stood humble but dignified, its weathered boards and simple cross a stark contrast to the gaudy false fronts of the business district. Pastor Grady was outside, splitting wood despite the cold. He straightened when he saw them, his kind eyes taking in their troubled expressions. "Seems like you two could use a warm drink and a quiet place to sit," he said, leading them inside. In the pastor's small study, they told him about the morning's events. Grady listened carefully, his weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. "Pride's a funny thing," he said when they finished. "The world tells us to defend it at all costs, but the good book says something different. Sometimes the greatest strength lies in showing mercy to those who show us none." "They humiliated her," Elijah growled, "treated her like she was nothing." "And yet here she sits," Grady replied, "more concerned with your anger than their insults. That's its own kind of strength, wouldn't you say?" Millie's eyes glistened. "I faced worse than words, Pastor, but I worry about what this means for the claim. If they won't process it—" "Leave that with me," Grady said. "I've known Thomas Hartle since he was a boy with patches on his pants. Sometimes people need reminding of where they came from." He paused, studying them both. "Meanwhile, remember that mercy isn't just about forgiving others. Sometimes it's about forgiving ourselves for not being what the world expects us to be." The ride home was quiet, snow starting to fall in lazy spirals around them. Elijah's thoughts churned like the creek in spring thaw. He watched Millie from the corner of his eye, saw how she held herself straight despite the day's wounds, and something shifted in his chest. They reached the cabin as dusk was settling in. While Millie tended to the mule, Elijah went to his workshop, a lean-to attached to the cabin's north side. Among the pelts and tools, a project sat half-finished, a chair he'd been working on in secret, carved from sturdy pine. He'd noticed how the cabin's furniture wasn't built for someone of Millie's size, how she carefully tested each seat before trusting it with her full weight. The chair he was making was broad and strong, with a high back and sturdy arms, each piece selected and shaped with care. Long into the night, he worked by lantern light. The scrape of his tools provided rhythm to his thoughts, Every curl of wood that fell to the floor seemed to take a piece of his old bitterness with it. The chair took shape under his hands, not fancy, but honest and welcoming, like Millie herself. When the last piece was fitted and the final smoothing done, Elijah stood back to look at his work. Dawn was approaching, turning the workshop's window gray. He ran his hand over the chair's arm, feeling the warmth of the wood beneath his calloused palm. Moving quietly, he carried the chair into the cabin. Millie was already up, stoking the fire for breakfast. She turned at his entrance and froze, her eyes widening as she took in what he held. Elijah cleared his throat. Been working on this, for you. Notice the other chairs don't fit right. Millie approached slowly, her hand reaching out to touch the smooth pine. You made this? For me? He nodded, not trusting his voice. She circled the chair, taking in the careful details, the slight curve of the back, the solid construction, the smooth finish that would never snag a dress. It's beautiful, she whispered. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she sank into the seat, which held her perfectly. No one's ever, to take such care. I'm sorry, Elijah said roughly, for how I was when you first came. Cold as winter wind. You deserved better. Millie wiped her eyes with her apron. You weren't cold, she said softly. Just frozen. There's a difference. The morning light grew stronger, filling the cabin with gentle radiance. They sat together at the table, sharing fresh bread and coffee, the new chair holding Millie as naturally as if it had always been there. Neither spoke much, but the silence was full of understanding. Through the window, they could see fresh snow beginning to fall, each flake catching the light like a tiny star before joining its fellows on the ground. The world outside might be harsh, but in here, they had created something warm and true, a space where judgment couldn't reach, and kindness grew as naturally as pine trees on the mountain. A week of relative peace had settled over the cabin. The rhythm of their days fell into a comfortable pattern, Elijah checking his trap lines while Millie baked and kept house. The snow had hardened into packed trails, making travel easier, though the bite of winter still hung sharp in the air. That morning started like any other. Millie was kneading dough at the table, her strong arms working the mass with practiced skill. Elijah sat cleaning his rifle by the fire, stealing glances at her when he thought she wasn't looking. The quiet between them had grown comfortable, like a well-worn blanket. The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered their peace. Elijah rose, setting his rifle aside but keeping it within reach. Through the frosted window, he spotted Thomas Hartle's fine black stallion picking its way up the path. The mine owner's tailored coat and polished boots looked out of place against the rugged mountain backdrop. Stay inside, Elijah told Millie, his voice low. She nodded, but moved closer to the window, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. Hartle dismounted with practiced grace, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. His smile was as slick as spring ice. Morning, Boone. Mrs. Dobbs. He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. Thought we might discuss a business proposition. Elijah stepped onto the porch, deliberately blocking the doorway. Say your piece. Now. Hartle's voice dripped false warmth. This concerns the lady as well. Surely we can be civilized. After a moment's hesitation, Elijah stepped aside. Hartle entered, his eyes sweeping the cabin's humble interior with poorly concealed disdain. He placed his portfolio on the table, careful to avoid the scattered flour. I've been reviewing the situation with your overlapping land claims, Hartle began, pulling out several official-looking documents. It's quite the legal tangle. Boundary disputes, water rights, prior claims. Could take months to sort out in court, maybe years. Millie moved to stand beside Elijah, her shoulder barely touching his arm. The contact steadied him. "But I'm a reasonable man," Hartle continued, spreading the papers across the table. "I'm prepared to offer you both a solution. Clean and simple." He produced a contract with flourishing handwriting. "I'll buy out both claims. Fair market value, cash on hand. Save you the headache of fighting this out when spring comes." Elijah frowned at the dense legal language. The words seemed to swim before his eyes, full of terms he didn't fully grasp. He'd never been much for reading, preferring the honest simplicity of working with his hands. "How much?" Millie asked quietly. Hartle named a figure that made Elijah's jaw clench. It was a fraction of what the land was worth, especially with the water rights included. "That's robbery," Elijah growled. "That's business." Hartle's smile turned cold. "With the legal confusion, neither claim is worth much on its own. I'm doing you a favor, really, especially you, Mrs. Dobbs. A woman alone has no business trying to homestead, much less run a bakery. The wilderness is no place for—" His eyes ran over her figure with deliberate insult. "Someone of your delicate constitution." Elijah felt Millie stiffen beside him. "Now," Hartle continued, pulling out a pen, "shall we discuss terms? Though I must say, Mrs. Dobbs, you might consider investing in a larger table. This one seems rather overwhelmed by your presence." The crude joke hung in the air like poison. "Get out." Elijah's voice was deadly quiet. Hartle blinked, feigning innocence. "Come now, just a bit of humor. No need to be so sensitive about our soft-bodied fool of a—" He never finished the sentence. Elijah moved faster than thought, grabbing Hartle's expensive coat and slamming him against the porch post. The impact knocked loose a shower of snow from the roof. "I said get out." Each word came out like chips of ice. Fear flickered across Hartle's face, quickly replaced by fury. "You'll regret this, Brett, Boone. Both of you will." He straightened his coat with trembling hands. "Nobody refuses Thomas Hartle. Nobody." They watched him mount up and ride away, his threats carried off by the winter wind. Only when he disappeared around the bend did Elijah realize Millie was shaking. "I'm sorry," he said roughly, turning to her. "Shouldn't have lost my temper. Made things worse, probably." "Don't." Millie's voice quavered but held firm. "Don't apologize for defending me." Her eyes met his, bright with unshed tears. "No one's ever. I mean, most folks just laugh along when people make jokes about my size, or pretend not to hear." Elijah's chest ached at the pain in her voice. "Ain't right, treating anyone that way, especially not you." He hesitated, then added softly, "You're worth 10 of him." A blush colored Millie's cheeks. She ducked her head, but not before he caught her smile. They spent the rest of the day in quiet industry, each lost in thought. Millie baked enough bread to feed half the mountain, as she always did when troubled. Elijah checked and rechecked his traps, though his mind wasn't on the task. Night fell early, as it always did in winter. After supper they sat by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. The chair Elijah had made for Millie creaked softly as she rocked. "I'm sorry," he said again, breaking the silence. "Not for hitting him. He deserved that. But for maybe making trouble worse. He stared into the fire, searching for words. "Couldn't stand hearing him talk about you that way. Wanted to keep you safe." Millie's rocking stilled. In the firelight, her face was soft with something he couldn't quite name. Slowly, carefully, she reached out and laid her hand on his arm. "You already did," she said simply. The touch of her hand sent warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the fire. They sat there in companionable silence, watching the flames dance and listening to the wind song in the pines outside. Neither mentioned how her hand stayed on his arm, or how he shifted slightly closer to her chair. The threats would need dealing with tomorrow. Hardell wasn't a man to forget an insult, and his power in the territory wasn't to be taken lightly. But for now, in the quiet of their shared cabin, none of that seemed to matter. What mattered was the steady presence of the woman beside him, her quiet strength and unflagging kindness. What mattered was how defending her had felt more right than anything he'd done in years. What mattered was this strange, warm feeling growing in his chest, something he'd thought had died with his wife, but was somehow, impossibly, beginning to bloom again. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up the chimney like rising stars. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the cabin, a different kind of thaw was taking place. Neither of them spoke of it, but both felt the shift, as natural and inevitable as winter giving way to spring. The morning sun painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose gold as Elijah studied the cabin's roof with a critical eye. Loose shingles rattled in the wind, and patches of worn wood showed through in places. He hadn't bothered fixing it properly in years. One man didn't need much shelter. But now, watching Millie sweep snow from the porch below, he felt a sudden urgency to make things right. "Reckon that roof needs more than patches," he called down to her. "Storm's coming next week. Best shore it up proper." Millie paused her sweeping, shielding her eyes against the glare. "I was thinking the same thing. Noticed a draft above my bed last night." She hesitated, then added with a small smile, "Though I suppose my extra padding keeps me warmer than most." Elijah's expression softened. Where once her self-deprecating jokes had made him uncomfortable, he now recognized them as armor against a world that had been unkind. "Your heart keeps you warm," he replied gruffly. "Rest is just wrapping." A blush colored her cheeks as she returned to her sweeping, humming softly. They spent the morning gathering supplies, fresh-cut pine boards from Elijah's stockpile, nails he'd been hoarding, and strips of tar paper traded from the general store months ago. The ladder creaked under his weight as he climbed, but held steady. "Hand me that hammer," he called down. When Millie passed it up, their fingers brushed briefly. The touch sent warmth through him despite the cold. Working together, they fell into an easy rhythm. Millie learned to anticipate his needs, passing tools and materials before he asked. When she suggested a clever way to overlap the tar paper for better protection, Elijah found himself nodding in approval. "You've got a good head for this kind of work," he said, meaning it. "Had to learn fast after James died," she replied, referring to her late husband. "Nobody else was going to fix things for me." The afternoon brought heavy clouds and fresh snow. They moved their work to the ground, digging paths through drifts that reached past Millie's waist. Elijah insisted on taking the lead, breaking trail through the deepest parts. "You don't have to protect me," Millie protested, though her eyes showed gratitude. "Maybe I want to," he answered simply, and kept shoveling. That evening, after a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Millie announced she had something to teach him in return. "Every man should know how to make bread," she declared, pulling out her flour bin. "It's God's simplest gift, just flour, water, and patience." Elijah's large hands felt clumsy in the soft dough, but Millie guided them gently. "Like this," she demonstrated, kneading with sure movements. "You've got to feel when it's right. Too rough and it won't rise proper. Too gentle and it won't develop strength." He found himself mesmerized by the way she worked the dough, her movements confident and graceful. When she caught him watching, he quickly looked away, focusing on his own misshapen lump. "You're doing fine," she encouraged. "Bread's forgiving. It knows when you're trying your best." The next morning, his first loaf came out of the oven dark and crusty, but proudly edible. Millie declared it perfect for toast, and the smile she gave him was warmer than fresh bread. In return, Elijah took her into the woods, showing her how to set snares for rabbits. Her clever fingers quickly mastered the knots, though she insisted on saying a brief prayer for any animal they might catch. "Seems right," she explained, "to thank the Lord for providing, and ask the creature's forgiveness for taking its life." Elijah nodded, remembering how his wife had done the same. The memory, for once, didn't bring pain. The days fell into a pleasant pattern. They worked side by side, sharing tasks and teaching each other. Millie's laughter came more freely now, and Elijah found himself speaking more than he had in years. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes just enjoying the comfortable silence. One night, as they finished the last of the venison stew, Millie spoke hesitantly. "I've been thinking about the bakery, in Silverton." Elijah looked up, waiting. "I know it sounds foolish, but..." She twisted her apron in her hands. "I thought maybe to call it Boone and Bread." The spoon froze halfway to his mouth. That'd be my name," he said slowly. "Well, yes." Millie's cheeks flushed pink in the firelight. "See, I thought, since we're sharing the land anyway, maybe we could share the work too? You're getting right handy with the baking, and I know about running a business, and 2 pairs of hands are better than 1, and..." She trailed off, watching his face anxiously. Elijah felt warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. The idea of his name linked with hers, of working together each day, of building something permanent. It stirred feelings he'd thought long buried. I'd be honored," he managed finally, his voice rough with emotion. The smile she gave him could have melted all the snow in the San Juans. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Millie had baked extra loaves, wrapping them carefully in clean cloth. "The Ute family down by the creek," she explained. "I've seen their smoke these past days, and with the snow so deep..." Elijah nodded, understanding. He'd known the family for years, trading pelts occasionally but keeping his distance, as he had with everyone. But Millie's way of thinking about neighbors and sharing came as natural as breathing to her. They hitched up the mule and packed the bread, along with some dried apples Millie had been saving. The trail to the creek was barely visible under the fresh snow, but the mule picked its way surely, following Elijah's lead. The Ute family's winter camp lay in a sheltered hollow, 3 sturdy lodges built against the wind. Smoke rose steadily from the central fire, where 2 Rivers, the family's matriarch, worked on a piece of beadwork. She looked up as they approached, her weathered face showing neither surprise nor unwelcome. "Good morning," Millie called out cheerfully. "We brought some fresh bread to share." 2 Rivers rose slowly, her dark eyes taking in the odd pair before her, the mountain man she'd known from distance for years, and this new woman who radiated warmth like a summer sun. After a moment, she nodded and gestured them closer. The exchange was simple, but meaningful. The bread was received with dignity, and 2 Rivers disappeared briefly into her lodge, returning with strips of dried venison, a gift of equal value freely given. Millie accepted with genuine thanks, and soon they were all seated by the fire, sharing coffee and broken pieces of fresh bread. 2 Rivers' granddaughter, a girl of perhaps 12 years, watched Millie with obvious fascination. When Millie smiled at her, the girl darted forward to touch her skirt, then scampered back, giggling. "She likes your colors," 2 Rivers explained in careful English, "like sunset on snow." Millie beamed, breaking off an extra piece of bread for the child. "Your beadwork is beautiful," she replied, admiring the intricate pattern taking shape under 2 Rivers' skilled hands. "The colors remind me of spring flowers." They stayed longer than planned, the conversation flowing easier than Elijah would have expected. He found himself watching Millie, marveling at how naturally she bridged the gap between cultures with simple kindness and genuine interest. As they prepared to leave, Two Rivers pressed a small beaded pouch into Millie's hands. "For good fortune," she said, "and for bringing warmth to cold places." Her eyes flickered briefly to Elijah, and the ghost of a smile touched her lips. On the ride home, Millie was quiet, but her face glowed with contentment. Finally, she spoke. "You know what I love about bread?" She patted the remaining loaves in their basket. "Share it with one person, they share with another, and pretty soon everyone's had a taste. Kindness works the same way. It always doubles when shared." Elijah looked at her then, really looked at her. This woman who had stumbled into his life during a blizzard and somehow melted the ice around his heart. Without thinking, he smiled, and was surprised to realize it held no trace of his usual bitterness. "Reckon you're right about that," he said softly. The mule plodded steadily through the snow, carrying them home to their shared cabin. Above them, the winter sun sparkled on untouched drifts, and somewhere in the distance, a jay called out in greeting. Elijah felt something shift inside him, like ice breaking up on a spring river, the slow but inevitable thaw of a heart remembering how to hope. The late February sun worked steadily at the snow, turning crystalline drifts into heavy, wet masses that slumped from tree branches and dripped from the cabin's eaves. Elijah watched the changing season from his porch, noting how the path to the barn had begun to show patches of mud beneath the trampled white. Winter's grip was loosening, which meant decisions about the land couldn't be put off much longer. He saddled his horse just after sunrise, telling Millie he needed to check for mail in Silverton. She handed him a wrapped biscuit still warm from the oven, her fingers brushing his as she passed it over. "Mind you don't let it get cold before eating," she said, adjusting his scarf with a motherly fuss that made his chest tighten. "Nothing worse than a cold biscuit." The ride into town took longer than usual, his horse picking carefully around softening snowbanks and muddy patches. The mountains rose sharp and clear against the morning sky, their peaks still firmly locked in winter, while the valleys below surrendered to spring's advance. Silverton's muddy main street was quieter than usual, with only a few wagons creaking past the feed store. Elijah tied his horse outside the post office, stamping snow from his boots before entering. The clerk, young Jimmy Peters, looked up from his sorting with an expression that made Elijah's stomach sink. "Mr. Boone," Jimmy said, his voice unusually formal. "I was hoping you'd come in soon. There's something you ought to know." Elijah waited, his hand resting on the counter's worn wood. Jimmy glanced around the empty office before continuing in a lower voice. "It's about your land claims, sir. And Miss Dobbs's, too. I saw something I wasn't supposed to see." He swallowed hard. "Mr. Hartle came in last week with Marshal Kane. They were talking to Wallace, the survey clerk. I was sorting mail in the back room, but I heard plenty." The young man's hands twisted nervously at his vest buttons. Hartle gave Wallace an envelope thick with cash, said it was compensation for correcting an oversight. Then they started talking about property lines and how certain claims might need reviewing for technical errors. Cold spread through Elijah's chest. "What kind of errors?" "Wallace agreed to void both titles, yours and Miss Dobbs's. He's going to claim the original survey was faulty, that the markers were set wrong." Jimmy's voice dropped even lower. "Once that happens, the land reverts to open territory, and Hartle's already got papers drawn up to claim it first." Elijah's fingers dug into the counter's edge. "When?" "The paperwork goes through next week. I'm sorry, Mr. Boone. I would have sent word, but—" Jimmy gestured helplessly at the snow outside. The mail rider's been delayed 3 days running." Anger rose in Elijah's throat, thick and bitter as creek mud. He wanted to ride straight to Hartle's office, to grab the man by his fancy collar and show him what mountain justice looked like. But the image of Millie's face stopped him, her gentle faith, her quiet determination to see good in others. He forced his voice level. "Much obliged for telling me, Jimmy." The ride home seemed endless. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow, and his horse's hooves made wet, sucking sounds in the softening ground. His mind churned with the news, trying to find a way to tell Millie that wouldn't destroy her hope entirely. Smoke rose straight and steady from the cabin's chimney as he approached. Through the window, he could see Millie moving about, her shadow passing back and forth in the lamplight. The smell of fresh bread filled the yard. Inside, every surface held cooling loaves and carefully wrapped packages. Millie looked up from her work, flour dusting her cheeks and hair. "I'm baking for Sunday service," she explained cheerfully. "Pastor Grady mentioned how some of the mining families are struggling, what with the winter being so hard. Thought we might bring a bit of comfort their way." Elijah's throat closed up. Here she was, thinking of others, planning for a future that might be stolen from her in a week's time. He couldn't bring himself to speak the truth. Not yet. Instead, he hung up his coat and asked if she needed help. They worked together through the evening, Elijah splitting wood for the stove, while Millie shaped her last batch of loaves. The familiar rhythm of their shared tasks should have been comforting, but guilt gnawed at him with every passing hour. Millie noticed his silence, casting concerned glances his way as they ate their simple supper. Finally, as they sat by the stove watching the flames dance behind the grate, she spoke softly. "Something's troubling you, Elijah. I can see it in your eyes." He stared at his hands, rough and calloused from years of trapping, hands that couldn't protect what mattered most. "Got some news in town today," he said finally, his voice rough. "Bad news." Millie set aside her mending, giving him her full attention. The lamplight caught the silver threads in her dark hair, reminding him how much living she'd already done, how many hardships she'd already faced. Slowly, haltingly, he told her everything: Hartle's bribe, the corrupt clerk, the impending loss of their land. With each word, he expected to see her crumple, to watch hope drain from her face like snowmelt from a mountain. Instead, she listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. When he finished, silence filled the cabin, broken only by the pop and hiss of burning wood. Finally, Millie spoke, her voice steady and sure. "Well then, we'll pray about it." Elijah made a sound between a laugh and a scoff. "Pray? Millie, you don't understand. This isn't something prayer can fix. This is men with money and power doing what they please. God ain't interested in land disputes." "The Lord is interested in justice," she replied firmly, "and in the affairs of His children. We'll pray, and we'll trust Him to show us the way forward." "What way forward? Once those papers are voided, we've got nothing. No legal claim, no right to stay. Hardell will own it all, and your dreams of a bakery will die right along with my trapping rights." Millie stood up slowly, her sturdy frame casting a shadow on the cabin wall. "My dreams aren't built on paper, Elijah Boone. They're built on faith. Faith in God's goodness, and in the knowledge that He puts us where we need to be, when we need to be there." She moved to stand beside his chair, close enough that he could smell the lingering scent of bread and wood smoke that always surrounded her. "I didn't end up at your door that night by accident, and you didn't open it by chance. There's purpose in all of it, even if we can't see it yet." Elijah looked up at her, this woman who had brought light back into his dark world. Her face glowed with certainty, with a trust so deep It shamed his own bitter doubts. Something moved in his chest, an ache that was both painful and sweet. "How can you be so sure?" he whispered. "Because I've seen God's faithfulness before. When John died in that mine collapse, I thought my world had ended. But the Lord sent me here, to this mountain, to you." She paused, color rising in her cheeks. "And I believe he had a reason for that." Elijah's hand moved of its own accord, reaching toward hers where it rested on the chair's arm. He stopped just short of touching her, his fingers trembling in the space between them. They sat like that through the long night hours, not quite touching, not quite apart. The fire burned low in the stove, casting a gentle glow across the cabin's wooden walls. Outside, an owl called softly to its mate, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote answered. Millie prayed quietly, her words a steady stream of faith and supplication. Elijah didn't pray himself, but he listened, letting her voice wash over him like spring water over stones. Gradually, her certainty began to seep into his own troubled heart. As false dawn began to pale the eastern sky, Millie's prayers finally ceased. She looked at Elijah with tired but peaceful eyes. "Whatever comes," she said softly, "we'll face it together. That's what neighbors do." Elijah nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Their hands still hovered near each other, a promise unspoken but deeply felt. Outside, the snow continued its slow surrender to spring, and somewhere above the clouds, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, bearing witness to two souls learning to trust in something larger than themselves. The late morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin's porch when hoofbeats approached through the melting snow. Elijah looked up from mending a broken trap to see young Jimmy, the telegraph operator's son, riding hard up the trail. The boy's face was flushed with more than just the cold. "Mr. Boone!" Jimmy called out, reining his horse to a stop. His gloved hand thrust forward, holding a yellow telegram envelope. "Pa said to bring this straight away. It's from the sheriff." Millie appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She and Elijah exchanged worried glances before he took the envelope. His fingers trembled slightly as he tore it open, unfolding the thin paper inside. The message was brief but devastating. "Both land claims nullified. Stop water rights reverted to county. Stop vacate premises by month-end. Stop." Elijah's jaw clenched so tight he could hear his teeth grinding. Without a word, he handed the telegram to Millie. She read it quickly, her face paling beneath her usual healthy glow. "Jimmy," she called to the boy, who sat uncertainly in his saddle. "Would you like some fresh bread before you ride back?" The boy shook his head. "No, ma'am, thank you. Pa needs me back at the office. He hesitated, glancing at Elijah. "There's more telegrams coming in about the water rights. Mr. Hardle's men are already setting up camp by the river bend." Elijah's head snapped up. "What?" "Yes, sir. 4 wagons full of men and equipment. They're building some kind of water station or dam or something." Jimmy shifted uncomfortably. "Pa said I should tell you peaceful-like, so there's no trouble." "Peaceful?" Elijah spat the word like a curse. He started toward his horse, but Millie's hand caught his arm. "Thank you, Jimmy," she said firmly. "You ride safe now." They watched the boy gallop away before Millie turned to Elijah, her grip still tight on his sleeve. "Don't you dare go charging down there half-cocked." "They can't just take it," he growled. "That water feeds half the homesteads in the valley. Hardle means to choke us all out." "Then we'll fight it proper, through the law." "The law?" Elijah laughed bitterly. "The law just told us we've got no claim to anything. The law's in Hardle's pocket, same as that corrupt clerk." The sound of wagon wheels and horses interrupted them. Pastor Grady's familiar buggy appeared around the bend, the old preacher handling the reins with practiced ease. He pulled up beside the porch, his weathered face grave beneath his broad-brimmed hat. "I heard the news in town," he said without preamble. "Thought you might need some counsel." Elijah turned away, but Millie welcomed the pastor inside. Soon they sat around the kitchen table, steam rising from cups of coffee. Pastor Grady listened as they explained about Hardle's men at the river. "The Lord commands patience in times of trial," the pastor said slowly. "Violence will only give Hardle the excuse he needs to bring the full weight of the law down on you." "Patience?" Elijah stood so suddenly his chair nearly toppled. "I've been patient for 10 years, watched everything I love get stripped away, piece by piece. And now you want me to sit quiet while that snake steals what little I have left?" "Elijah," Millie pleaded, but he was already striding toward the door. "I'm going to town," he announced. "Going to look that sheriff in the eye and demand justice." Pastor Grady rose. "Son, that's not the way—" But Elijah was already gone. They heard his horse's hooves pounding down the trail, fading into the distance. "He's going to do something foolish," Millie whispered. The pastor nodded gravely. "Pride's a fearsome thing when it's wounded. Makes a man forget everything he knows is right." In Silverton, Elijah threw open the sheriff's office door so hard it bounced against the wall. Sheriff Matthews looked up calmly from his desk, as if he'd been expecting this visit. "You can't let Hardle steal that water," Elijah demanded. "People depend on it. Children depend on it." "Mr. Boone," the sheriff said evenly, "the county's decision is final. The water rights have been properly reassigned according to law." "According to bribes, you mean?" Matthews' expression hardened. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Boone. One that could land a man in jail if he's not careful." "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning." The sheriff stood, hooking his thumbs in his gun belt. "This town's got enough troubles without you stirring up more. Now I'm giving you fair notice. You cause any disturbance, interfere with Mr. Hardle's legal operations in any way, and I'll have you behind bars so fast your head'll spin." Elijah's hands clenched into fists. For a long moment, the only sound was the tick of the wall clock, and his own ragged breathing. Finally, without another word, he turned and stormed out. The ride home was a blur of rage and despair. By the time he reached the cabin, the sun was setting, painting the snow-patched mountains blood red. Millie stood from her rocking chair as he stamped onto the porch. "What happened?" she asked softly. "What happened?" He laughed harshly. "Same thing that always happens. The rich man wins, the poor man loses, and God sits up there not caring one way or the other." "Don't blaspheme," she said sharply. "The Lord hasn't abandoned us." "Hasn't he?" Elijah stormed inside, yanking his trail pack from its peg. "Where was he when my wife died? Where was he when my crops failed? Where is he now?" He began shoving clothes and supplies into the pack. Millie watched him, her face pale but composed. "What are you doing? What does it look like? I'm leaving. No point fighting what can't be won." "Running, you mean?" Her voice was quiet but cut like a knife. "Running from your pain. Same as you've been doing for 10 years. He whirled on her. "You don't know anything about my pain." "Don't I?" Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "I know about watching someone you love die. I know about having everything you worked for crumble to dust. But I also know that running won't heal your soul, Elijah Boone. It'll just make the wounds deeper." "Then what's your answer? Prayer? Faith?" He spat the words like poison. "Tell me, Millie, what has all your praying gotten you? A failed claim? A stolen future?" She flinched as if he'd struck her, and something in his chest cracked at the sight. But his pride wouldn't let him take the words back. He turned away, continuing to pack. Very well, she said after a long moment. The scrape of a chair made him look up. She was at her own trunk now, methodically removing her few possessions. What are you doing? If you're leaving at dawn, then so am I. Her voice was flat, emotionless. There's nothing here for either of us now. The sight of her packing, this woman who had brought warmth and hope back into his cold world, hit him harder than any physical blow. But his wounded pride wouldn't let him speak the words that might make her stay. They worked in silence as darkness fell, each packing their separate belongings, each believing the other had given up. The cabin that had slowly become a home now felt like a tomb, filled with the ghosts of what might have been. Pastor Grady's words came back to haunt him. Pride's a fearsome thing when it's wounded. Elijah glanced at Millie's straight back as she folded her shawl, seeing how her hands trembled slightly despite her composed face. He wanted to reach out, to apologize, to ask her to stay, but the words stuck in his throat like thorns. Outside, an owl called mournfully into the gathering night. Inside, two wounded souls prepared to part ways, each believing they'd failed the other, each too proud or too hurt to bridge the growing chasm between them. When all was packed, Millie took her blanket to the rocking chair, while Elijah made his bed by the dying fire. Neither spoke as darkness claimed the cabin. But in the deep hours of the night, when he thought she was asleep, Elijah heard the soft sound of her crying, and felt his own tears fall silently into his beard. Dawn would come too soon, bringing with it the bitter taste of farewell, and the knowledge that sometimes the heaviest chains are the ones we forge ourselves. Dawn painted the mountains in shades of steel gray as Elijah stirred from his restless sleep by the cold hearth. The cabin felt wrong, too quiet, too empty. His eyes found Millie's rocking chair, now vacant, and his heart stumbled. A piece of paper lay folded on the seat, his name written in her careful hand. His fingers trembled as he opened it. 5 words stabbed through his chest. I'd rather be homeless than unloved. Millie! He burst through the door into swirling snow. The storm had returned overnight, fierce and unrelenting. Fresh powder covered everything, but he could still make out her footprints leading away from the cabin. She couldn't have gotten far in this weather. The tracks headed toward the river trail. Elijah rushed back inside, grabbed his heavy coat and rifle, and saddled his horse. The wind howled like a wounded beast, driving ice-sharp flakes into his face as he followed her trail. Lord, he whispered, the prayer feeling strange on his lips after so many years. Lord, please. But the wind snatched away his words, erasing Millie's footprints before his eyes. Hour after hour, he searched, calling her name until his voice grew hoarse. His horse struggled through drifts that reached its chest. The cold crept through his clothes, numbing his hands and feet, but fear for Millie burned hotter than any fire. As afternoon faded into evening, darkness gathered early under the storm-black sky. Elijah's hope dwindled with the light. Then, through the curtain of snow, he spotted something dark against the white, her wagon overturned in a drift. Beside it lay her mule, already frozen. Millie, his voice cracked as he leapt from his horse. There, half buried in the snow, he found her. She clutched a burlap sack to her chest, the bread she'd baked for the Indian agency, her last act of kindness even as she fled. Elijah fell to his knees beside her still form. No, no, please, God, no. He gathered her into his arms, her skin like ice against his. Don't take her too. I'll do anything. Just don't take her from me. Tears froze on his cheeks as he lifted her. I'm sorry, he choked out. I'm so sorry, Millie. Please don't leave me alone again. He managed to get her onto his horse, cradling her against his chest as they fought their way back through the storm. With every step, he prayed, really prayed, for the first time since his wife died. Not the bitter accusations he'd hurled at God for years, but desperate pleas for mercy. "I know I don't deserve it," he whispered into Millie's hair. "But she does. She believes in you. She sees good in everything, even a broken old fool like me. Please, Lord, please." The journey home seemed endless. His horse stumbled more than once, but somehow kept going. Elijah's arms ached from holding Millie, but he wouldn't let go. Not ever again. "You brought warmth back into my life," he told her unconscious form. "You made me remember what it feels like to care. Don't give up on me now, Millie. I need you." Finally, the cabin's dark shape emerged from the white void. Elijah carried her inside, laid her gently on his bed by the hearth. He built up the fire with shaking hands, wrapped her in every blanket he owned. Her breath came shallow and slow, but she was alive. Elijah sank to his knees beside the bed, clutching her cold hand in both of his. "Lord," he prayed aloud, no longer caring about pride or past hurts, "I know I turned my back on you, but please, if you're listening, save her. She's worth 1,000 of me. She's got so much love to give. The world needs her light." Tears fell freely now, as 10 years of buried grief broke free. "I'm sorry I blamed you when Sarah died. I'm sorry I let bitterness poison everything. Just please, please let Millie live. I love her, Lord. I love her, and I never told her." The fire crackled in the silence after his words. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside Elijah's heart, something long frozen began to thaw. For 2 days and nights, Elijah kept his vigil beside Millie's bed. Dark circles deepened under his eyes as he tended the fire, letting it burn hot enough to chase the deadly cold from her bones. Every hour, he spooned warm broth between her pale lips, praying she would swallow. "Lord," he murmured, his voice growing, hoarse from constant prayer. "I know I've been a poor servant, but if you spare her, I'll open my heart again. I'll help others like she taught me." His rough hands never stopped moving, rubbing warmth back into her fingers, adjusting blankets or wiping her brow with a damp cloth. The cabin filled with his whispered promises. He would help the Ute families through winter. He would defend the weak against men like Hardle. He would learn to bake bread for those in need. Each vow felt like a key, unlocking the prison of grief he'd built around himself. On the second evening, as he dozed in his chair beside her, a soft sound snapped him awake. Millie's eyes had opened, finding his face in the firelight. "I knew you'd come," she whispered, her voice barely stronger than a breath. Something broke inside Elijah's chest. Tears spilled down his weathered cheeks as he clasped her hand. "I hadn't touched a woman in 10 years because I thought God was done with me," he confessed, his words tumbling out like spring thaw. "But he sent me you." A weak smile touched Millie's lips, bringing color back to her face. "Then don't waste the miracle." As if in answer to their words, the howling wind outside fell silent. The storm that had raged for days finally stilled, leaving only peace in its wake. Through the cabin's frosted window, starlight sparkled on new-fallen snow. 3 weeks passed before Millie could walk without trembling. On a bright Sunday morning, Elijah hitched their remaining mule to his wagon, helping her up with gentle hands. The church bells of Silverton rang across the valley as they made their slow journey into town. Pastor Grady's sermon echoed through the wooden walls when they pushed open the heavy doors. Every head turned as their boots creaked across the floorboards. Thomas Hardle's face darkened from his front row seat, while Deputy Crane straightened in surprise. "Pardon us, Pastor," Elijah's voice carried clear and strong. "But there's a matter of truth needs telling." His hat was clutched respectfully in his hands as he stood in the aisle. Pastor Grady nodded, setting down his Bible. "Then let's hear it, brother." "The papers from Harriet Boone, my wife's cousin. I reckon you kept them safe all these years." The pastor's eyes lit with understanding. From his study, he retrieved a leather folder, yellow with age. "I've held these since Harriet passed, waiting for the right time." He drew out a will, the paper crackling in the hushed church. Reading aloud, Pastor Grady confirmed what Providence had arranged. Millie was named sole heir to the disputed riverbank acres. Hartle's forged documents crumbled in the face of God's truth. The sheriff, red-faced with shame, stood up. "I'll have the deed restored proper-like by sundown." What happened next stunned the congregation. Millie stepped forward, extending her hand to Hartle. "No bitterness feeds a soul," she said softly. "I forgive you." Elijah watched this act of grace, his heart swelling. For the first time in years, he lifted his face heavenward in the house of God. "Thank you, Lord," he prayed aloud, his voice thick with gratitude, "for showing me the way back to faith through her." The morning light streamed through the stained glass, bathing them all in colors of mercy. Spring painted the San Juan Mountains in sweeping strokes of green and gold. The cabin that once sheltered two lonely souls now stood transformed, its weathered logs embracing a new purpose. A fresh-painted sign swung in the morning breeze: Millie's Bakery and Boone's Supply. Through the wide windows, lamplight mingled with sunshine as Millie kneaded dough at the counter, her voice lifting in amazing grace. The scent of fresh bread drew folks from all corners of the valley. Weather-beaten miners with tin cups, Ute mothers trading berries, and children pressing eager faces against the glass. Elijah moved between customers at his workbench, his calloused hands gentle on broken axe handles and dull saw blades. His eyes often drifted to Millie, wonder still fresh in his gaze. Every Sunday, they set out their free meal basket, piled high with day-old bread and dried venison. "The Lord provides," Millie would say, "so we provide for others." Outside, Elijah gathered local boys twice a week, teaching them to read deer signs and set humane traps. "Take only what you need," he'd counsel, "and thank the land for its gifts." His patience with their fumbling efforts showed how far he'd come from his hermit days. At her small desk, Millie penned letters to distant widows, offering work and lodging. "There's healing and purpose," she wrote, "and family and faith." Pastor Grady, watching folks gather round their pot-bellied stove one evening, smiled warmly. "Your place has become the heart of Silverton," he told them. "God's mercy flows through open doors." Millie reached for Elijah's hand beneath the counter, both their wedding rings catching the last light of day. Their shared redemption had grown into something larger than themselves, a beacon of kindness on the rugged frontier, proving that love could transform not just two hearts, but an entire community. Purple shadows stretched across the valley as the day drew to a close. Elijah and Millie sat together on their wide porch, watching the sun sink behind the jagged peaks of the San Juans. The evening air carried the lingering scent of fresh-baked bread from their shop, mixing with the sweet perfume of spring wildflowers. Elijah's weathered hands rested on the porch railing, his wedding band catching the last copper rays of sunlight. "Strange how life turns," he said softly, looking out at the trail that had brought Millie to him that stormy night. "If that blizzard hadn't blown in, you'd still be growling at your coffee pot," Millie teased, her eyes twinkling. She smoothed her apron, dusted with the day's flour. And I reckon you still owe me a biscuit for saving your soul that night." A low chuckle rumbled in his chest. "As I recall, you were the one who ate all my biscuits that morning." "Well, a frozen woman needs her strength." She smiled, remembering how his gruff exterior had melted like spring snow over those first careful days together. Elijah turned to face her, his expression tender in the fading light. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for her hand, the same hand he'd once been too broken to touch. His fingers intertwined with hers, strong and sure now, without hesitation. 10 years without a touch," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And now I can't remember what it was like to be empty." His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm, as if still amazed by the simple miracle of connection. Millie's eyes grew misty. She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. The familiar weight and warmth of her pressed against his side, chasing away the last shadows of his long solitude. From town, the evening church bells began to toll, their clear notes floating up through the valley. The sound carried memories of their wedding day just months ago, of prayers answered and faith restored. Inside their cabin-turned bakery, lamplight glowed golden through the windows. The light spilled across their porch, wrapping them in its gentle warmth. Tomorrow would bring more bread to bake, more travelers to feed, more lives to touch with kindness. But for now, they sat content in the deepening dusk, two once broken hearts made whole again. Millie sighed contentedly. "God does work in mysterious ways," she whispered. "That he does," Elijah agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "That he does." They stayed there as stars began to pierce the darkening sky, their shared silence full of gratitude for second chances, for love that healed, and for the grace that had brought them home at last. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.